We all know the real story of water is politics. Since 1960, there have been 13 major water bonds on the ballot, totaling over $30 billion. These bond initiatives have taken a life of their own. In the early 1960s, the California Water Resources Development Bond Act funded water infrastructure, the State Water Project, and flood control. Fast forward 50 years, and over time, you will see bonds with the word water funded just about everything but water. Well, times have changed. Since Thirst was released, but the politics, that was the video we were going to roll, but the politics, the Thunderball of it all, has not. Our last session, Thunderball, I love these themes with the bond, that's really great. Thunderball will provide a real insight to the politics of water bonds and what it takes to get an audience on the ballot and pass. Our panelists this morning are Rick Clausen, Leo Wallach, and Dave Puglia. I tried to say that right, it's the soft G. So Rick is a partner of Redwood Pacific Public Affairs. He has managed many of the firm's major ballot issue and public affairs campaigns on behalf of high-tech, venture capital, insurer, taxpayer, business, and tort reform groups. The firm has represented numerous national and state trade and business associations, as well as a number of major public corporations. Clausen has served on the board of directors of 3 publicly traded banks and currently serves on the board of Golden Pacific Bancorp. He also serves on the board of directors of the Frank Church Chair of Public Affairs at Boise State University in Idaho and regularly lectures on politics and campaigns at UC Berkeley, community colleges, and public forums in California. Leo is a principal at Raleigh, an issue advocacy and campaign firm with offices in San Francisco and Los Angeles. Leo works with clients to develop political and communication strategies, create television, advertising, and oversee complex and multifaceted communications campaigns. In California, he has played a role in a number of statewide campaigns, including several water and environmental issues. This includes Yes on 84, the largest water and environmental bond in state history. Before joining Raleigh this year, Leo managed Wallach Public Affairs and was previously vice president at Winter and Mandabach campaigns in Los Angeles. In 2011, Leo was named a rising star by Campaigns and Elections magazine. Leo grew up in Oakland, California, and graduated with a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from UCLA. Dave Puglia, is that better? Better, thank you. Got it, I got that, that's great. Dave leads Western Growers State Government Affairs, affairs team and the association's media communications staff on behalf of the association's 2,500 members in California and Arizona. As the organization's public policy advocates in Sacramento and Phoenix, Puglia and his team manage a diverse range of legislative and regulatory issues affecting the fresh produce industry and agricultural generally. Puglia also guides the association's communications department, which interacts with the news media and other external groups. In addition, Dave manages Western Growers Political Action Committee. Prior to joining Western Growers in 2005, Dave was vice president of APCO Worldwide, a global public affairs consulting firm. During his 6-year tenure, he helped build the firm's Sacramento practice, providing strategic advice and issues management expertise on public policy issues to numerous corporations and industry associations. That's a lot to say. Okay, so we're going to invite Rick to the stage, then Leo, and then Dave. And being sensitive to time, we're going to keep it at about 10 minutes per speak. So take it away, Rick.
Good, thanks so much. Good afternoon, and thank you for the invite. It's great to be at the happiest place in the world. You know, for 2 hours, unfortunately, I have to go back to Sacramento, which I can assure you these days is not the happiest place in the world. Maybe unless you're an FBI agent. They've been a little busy up there lately, so. Let me try to give you like a little 101 primer on ballot issues. We've done 49 statewide ballot measures over the last 20 years and won 40 of them, and we have won both yes and no campaigns. Obviously, a water bond requires a yes vote, and there are some significant differences between yes and no campaigns. So as you think about a water bond, it's really important to keep these points in mind. When you are going for a yes vote, you have to really have two challenges. One is to convince voters that there's a problem of such significance that it requires a public vote, it requires a bond, for instance, to solve. The bigger hurdle is that you have created the right solution to solve that problem. Keep in mind that when voters look at these ballot issues, and I've had a lot of clients in oil and tobacco and insurance who will look at a measure that they want to propose and say, this is wonderful. This solves a lot of problems for farmers, insurance as a for instance. And I look at the farmers folks and say, you know what? The voters really don't care about solving problems for farmers or State Farm or Altria or Chevron. When voters vote on these ballot measures, they're looking to solve a problem for themselves. And they put these through a very narrow perspective, which is, what does this ballot measure do to me, to my family, to my pocketbook, to my security? So as you look at developing a water bond or taking that vote to the people, it's very, very important to make sure that you're solving problems for voters as they perceive them, not necessarily solving problems just for yourself. So it's very, very important as you move through that process to align the interests of voters with the yes vote on the water bond. They asked me to think about, is a smaller bond better? Is it better to have a few big projects? Is it better to go out and identify 100 small projects? And I will tell you, I don't have the answer to that. The advice I would suggest is that you spend a lot of time and a lot of money doing a lot of public opinion research to determine that, and let that drive the strategy behind the bond if you can do it. We have had instances where we have been brought on board early in the process to develop a proactive ballot measure, and we literally have worked with the attorneys and the clients. We have done a draft. We went out and tested it. We found out where the flaws were. We went back, corrected those, went back out with a second version, tested that, found that we still weren't there, brought it back, did some more work, took it out for a third statewide public opinion survey to get that down to where we thought we had eliminated every flaw or unintended consequence that someone on the other side could hang their hat on, and that we finally had a measure that we could get 51% plus support for. Keep in mind that on most ballot measures, when you're going for a yes vote, you want to be at least in that 60% yes vote on your initial survey, because that's as good as it generally gets. On ballot issues, the tendency is for support to drop as you go through the course of a campaign, not increase. The no vote increases, the yes doesn't. So you want to make sure you start with a good margin that you can sustain through the course of that campaign. And again, I think the most important lesson in all of this is put this in the perspective that voters can identify their self-interest and use the campaign to align their self-interest with the interests of the sponsors of the ballot measure. November, I suspect, would probably be a pretty good ballot for you. Again, that's something you want to take a look at with research, but I don't think anyone would argue that we don't have a problem now from the standpoint of the drought and the scarcity of water. So that's a big, important part of a campaign. You've got the problem, now you've got to make sure you have the right solution to that problem. So I think November would probably be a fairly good election for you. You also don't have a lot of other measures on the ballot trying to raise taxes. You don't have a lot of other bonds on that ballot, so it's fairly clean. You've got a few health care measures that are going to be on the ballot, but it's not like you've got 3 or 4 or 5 bonds to choose from or a couple tax increases that are on the ballot. So from your perspective, it's a fairly clean ballot in November. one last point on all of this is that it's going to be very important as a campaign is developed that you bring in all of these stakeholders and really present this as, these people in this room could not agree on the time of day, but they've all agreed that we have to have a solution, to our water crisis, to the drought. This is the best method that we have, excuse me, and make this one of the broadest coalitions in California history. Use those surrogates. You don't want just water folks involved. You want small business owners, minority leaders, community leaders, everyone you can find speaking out on behalf of the campaign. So with that, let me stop there, and we'll be happy to answer questions as we move through the panel. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I'm following one of the most storied practitioners of the dark arts, so that's not easy. You're hearing from a couple real pros today, by the way. I've worked with both these guys over the years in Sacramento. Unlike Rick, though, I don't have to go back to Sacramento today. About a year ago, I moved to Orange County, where Western Growers is headquartered. I escaped. So it is possible to do that. Although I got to go up there all the time anyway, so maybe it wasn't that great an escape. Some quick background about Western Growers, about myself. Western Growers Association represents fresh produce growers and shippers in California and Arizona. Mr. Del Bosque here, you heard from earlier, is one of our members. We are obviously very water dependent, and we played a very large role in the run-up to passage of the 2009 bond and the associated policy bills in the legislature. I spent maybe the majority of my time in public policy in those years working on the bond, and then transitioned over to campaign mode when we thought we were going to run a campaign, and we had to pull the plug. I'll talk a little bit about that, and Leo will probably as well, since he was one of the consultants on that campaign committee at the time. Today, of course, we're still heavily involved in the water bond discussions. There are a group of industry folks, labor, some environmental interests who are kind of putting the band back together to see if we can rework the existing bond, which is currently slated to be voted on in November, unless the legislature repeals and replaces it or modifies it. See if we can put up another product that has a shot at winning, and then putting together a campaign committee and funding a campaign, and we'll talk more about that as well. But let me first talk about some of the elements required to achieve success to get to that point where you have a viable campaign. And all of this is premised on the assumption, which may or may not be true, I think it is, that the current bond would fail if it stays on the ballot. And there are reasons for it. You probably have questions about that, but unfortunately, I think that bond has been tarnished maybe beyond repair, partly the product of its birth by the legislature and the kind of steady drumbeat of criticism since then about its size and its scope. So how do we get back on track for 2014? First, some very fundamental lobbying basics. Rick talked about initiative campaign basics. We've got to get a 2/3 vote in both the Assembly and the Senate to pass a bond. The same was true, by the way, if in a sort of fallback situation, we all come to the conclusion that we're going to have to push the bond vote off once again. I don't think anybody wants to do that. I don't want to do that. But if we end up in that position, that's also a 2/3 vote. So how do you get to 2/3? The 2009 effort was instructive. If you look at the final vote in both the Senate and the Assembly, you see almost exactly 2/3 of Republicans in the Senate, 2/3 of Republicans in the Assembly voting for. 2/3 of Democrats in the Senate, 2/3 of Democrats in the Assembly voting for. The methodology here actually is not that difficult. You're trying to find Democrats who will vote for spending on water infrastructure, including surface storage projects, which is abhorrent to a lot of environmental groups. So you're trying to find Democrats in the middle who can say no to some of the more liberal environmental groups. And on the other side, you're trying to find Republicans who can say yes to spending tax money on something. Because this is debt, and most Republicans have a reflexive problem with spending. So that's how we constructed a 2/3 supermajority in 2009. We sort of wrote off the hard right, never spend a dollar guys, and the hard left, no way am I going to support building dams. And we found our 2/3 in the center. That sounds easy to do. It's very difficult. You're asking people to take political risk with their own bases to put up a vote to do the right thing for California. So it's very, very tough. Now, complicating all that, and maybe benefiting in this year, both, is the fact that we've had so much turnover in the legislature since 2009. The Senate, which has 40 seats, you require 27 votes to get to 2/3. Of the 40 seats, 32 senators were members of the legislature in 2009. They're educated, they put up votes, they know what this is all about. But of those 32, Rick's comment about the FBI, 3 of them are no longer serving in the Senate, they're suspended, and they won't be back this year. So we're really talking about 29 senators, of whom 27 will be needed to put up a vote, who were there last time. The Assembly, it's even worse. 80 seats in the Assembly, only 16 were in the legislature in 2009. So challenge is to educate all of those new members about why the water bond was what it was in 2009 and what we need to do going forward, and persuade them to put up those votes. How do you get there? Rick made a comment about this. It's extremely important. The bond has to be regionally relevant across the state. It can't just be storage for farmers, new dams in the Central Valley. It can't just be urban projects for Southern California that leaves Northern California out of the game. There has to be something in it for every region of the state, and you do that by including provisions in the bond that are, if not earmarked, which can be called pork, are competitively awarded provisions that tend to go to one purpose or another: conservation, recycling, surface storage projects, groundwater cleanup, etc. That's how you build 2/3 in the legislature. And the benefit of that is if you can secure a 2/3 vote in both houses, you've probably done a pretty good job of setting up a campaign infrastructure across the state. Voters have to have self-interest. Industries have to be motivated to fund a campaign. Rick talked about research. That's extremely important. We're going to have a clear pathway where we can see how voters can come to vote yes on additional debt. What's interesting about bonds, and a little troubling, is that so many have been passed in the last 20 years without really having to mount major campaigns. There hasn't been strong funded opposition. But several cycles ago, we started to see a couple of bond measures get into trouble, non-controversial ones. I think there was a library bond that went down maybe 4 or 6 years ago with no funded opposition. And my takeaway from that is that voters have figured out that bonds aren't free money. They've now figured out that it's a credit card and that it comes at some other expense. And that complicates our challenge running a bond campaign. So you have to have that broad regional support. You have to have industries, multiple industries, who are committed to a fundraising effort, because these are very expensive campaigns to run, more so if there's opposition. But what needs to happen more than anything to me to clear the pathway here is we need Governor Brown. I don't think that a general obligation bond that has any controversy attached to it, which water always will be approved by the voters without the governor's support. Not just this governor, whoever sits in the corner office has to support a water bond. This governor, I think it's even more true because of his credibility on fiscal management, because of his popularity with the voters. He commands the heights politically in California. He has to be a vocal and ardent supporter of the bond. He has to campaign for it. He has to help raise money for it. Otherwise, I just don't see how we get there. He has a little bit of a challenge getting there because he has spoken often about the wall of debt that California has to deal with, not of his making. He's actually chipping away at it. But he's been very clear that he doesn't want to add general obligation debt service to California's general fund burden. And a bond does add general fund debt service, so that'll be a problem. I'll leave it to Leah to talk a little bit more about the political campaign side of things, but one of the factors that I think we all have to look at, assuming we have an engaged governor, is if the research tells us that we have some vulnerabilities with voters, that this bond with a strong funded opposition campaign can be taken down, even with the governor's support, then we have to start looking at questions about which ballot cycle to go. 2014 has some natural advantages. The drought has focused the minds of voters. We have very high awareness, but 2014 is not a presidential election year. And these guys can speak to that better than I can, but this bond requires high voter turnout. It requires Democratic voters to turn out. Democrats are more likely to vote for this bond than Republicans. And a presidential election year typically has much higher turnout and might be a better formula. So that is also up in the air. Let me just take 2 minutes to talk about some polling. I can't share with you some of the private numbers that I've seen because they're private. But first, a little bit of context. If you look at the support for this bond in different forms, in 2007, we had, according to most polls, about 64% support, 28% opposed. 2008, it was 60% support, right at Rick's threshold. But in 2010, as we were running up on a campaign to pass the bond that had just come out of the legislature, the support slipped to only 48%. We went under 50. So that was a very hard moment. We had to make a decision about whether we marched forward with Governor Schwarzenegger's support. His popularity was fading. The bond itself was struggling, or whether we pull the plug and kick it to 2012, which we ultimately did. In 2012, our surveys showed that only 45% of the voters supported it. So here we are in 2014. Rick said it bears repeating. Research is all important in guiding the decision whether to go forward with a campaign and then structuring the campaign. It's messages, it's messengers. But again, it bears repeating. The governor is the most important person in this discussion. And he's going to have to make a decision relatively soon about whether he can support a bond, both through the legislature and at the ballot box, because we're getting to the point where mounting a campaign is going to be very, very difficult because time is becoming a factor. So a lot of complications, a lot of moving parts. I do sense that there's a great opportunity here if we can line up the one last star in the constellation. So I'll stop there, and we'll take questions when we're done, I think. Thank you.
Thanks very much for having me, and thanks for taking part of your lunch to listen to politics. Hopefully you can still keep down your food. I think it's, the other speakers have touched on it, but ballot measures are kind of their own animal. It's a different kind of political campaign. It was said at the beginning we can't afford to ignore politics in water, and in this case we can't afford to ignore the voters in their totality, right? We need a majority. The ballot measure process can be relatively unforgiving. The burden of proof is on you if you have a yes vote. A lot of governors in this state, a lot of big policy ideas have kind of crashed on the rocks of public opinion and trying to get these things passed, because I think you're dealing not only with the issue at hand, but also with some inherent skepticism on the part of the voters. And I think there are some specific challenges here. There's also reason to be optimistic, though, so we should talk about those. I want to go back a little bit. I have been involved, as Dave mentioned, in a lot of ballot measure campaigns in California, but specifically a few that touch on water. Was part of a team that passed Prop 84 in 2006. As was mentioned, I think there was a joke about it in the opening. It was a different kind of water bond. It dealt with a little more with water quality and some more environmental projects, but there were some successful parts of that successful campaign that I think need to be replicated here. There was a measure that was well designed, and that was designed partly with public opinion research so that we knew it would work and our clients knew it would work. There was a broad coalition. There was a lack of major funded opposition. And there was a well-funded campaign. We had to get out in front of that thing and sell it. We absolutely did. In 2010, as Dave mentioned, I was part of a team of consultants that was brought together at the time to what we hope would be this monumental campaign to pass this water bond in 2010 that's still kicking around now. And it's important to think back to that time because we're sort of used to the fact now that for 3 cycles this water bond's been kicking around, but remember it took a long time to bring together a package that would actually pass the legislature, right? This is like a long-standing issue in California, very difficult to get agreement. And finally, they were able to get a bond together that actually got out of there. And it was kind of an inspiring thing because around the table, the people that were our clients running the campaign included certain environmental and conservation groups. It included agriculture. It included the business community at large. It included labor unions and the infrastructure interests. So it was a really broad coalition around this table. And it was great to see that. And it was a little painful when we had to recommend pulling the plug on it. There were actually a lot of positive things about the bond at the time. I mean, there was a lot of things that we had to sell. We felt we could run a good campaign. But after the financial crisis, a lot of cynicism about government at the time, it was just going to be too difficult, and it would have cost too much money, and that wasn't going to be had at the time. Fast forward to today, it's interesting, it's a little bit of a different situation. As the other speakers have referred to, it seems like it should be almost a perfect storm. We have the drought, which creates a lot of challenges, but also focuses people on water issues. I've seen 2 polls in legislative districts in Northern California. Water and the drought is the top issue, beyond education or the budget, any of these things that we've seen in past years. So that's pretty amazing. We've also seen approval of government. I think there's still a lot of cynicism creep back up again in California as some of the dysfunction in Sacramento has kind of gone by the wayside. We've seen the budget situation improve drastically. And there's some other things too, but I think there's still, a little bit of a shadow hanging over all this. It's been mentioned that maybe voters have a different attitude about debt than they had before the financial crisis. I think that's certainly true. While the budget situation's better, the economy's still pretty uneven in its recovery, so there's still going to be a lot of challenges in moving forward this year. In terms of the ingredients that we would need for a successful ballot measure campaign, first of all is the bond itself. Unlike a candidate or something where you kind of have to sell what you have, you actually can have a role as the client or as the interest group in actually crafting the thing that you're going to take before voters. And you have the ability to talk to policy experts, to use opinion research to craft the best possible thing to take in front of voters. I think the difficulty here is that on initiative, sometimes you might have one interest group that's trying to push this thing forward, and maybe they have some flexibility in how they design the initiative. In this case, it's playing out on 2 levels because it's also in the legislature. So there's a lot of things to balance in the legislature politically. Then you have the lens of public opinion, and you have to have something that works. So putting those 2 things together is just going to be really, really difficult. The current bond is $11 billion, which does make it a tough sell. It would be nice to obviously take that down a level so that it sort of gets below that 10 billion mark. It's hard to know exactly where that line is. But the bond was that size for a reason, right? Like I said, we had a big table. Well, there's got to be that money to bring people to the table. And as they try to create a smaller bond, it'll be interesting to see, can they keep that coalition together? Because I think if it leaves out regions, if it leaves out different interests, different uses of water, it's going to be very difficult for it to be successful. I mentioned you have to have the good coalition, and the design of the measure is going to have a lot to do with that. The coalition obviously brings credibility to the measure. It also raises money for the measure. And we need to make sure that the funded opposition is as small as possible. I think on a water bond like this that has to do with the water system, inevitably the far left and the far right are going to drop off for their own reasons. So we need the ability to sort of hold the center with that coalition. A big funded opposition is going to put the bond in trouble. There'll be niggling opposition, and different people have megaphones of different size, and you never know. But I think it's very important to isolate out any funded opposition if that can be done. As I mentioned, we need really good funding for the campaign. I think when we looked at this issue in 2010, it was obvious that education went a long way. I think people are vaguely aware that there's a water system in California and that a lot of work goes into it to make sure it gets to them. I'm sure you're all familiar with this. But a little explanation, a little reminder went a long way towards making people more receptive to the bond. So I think having a campaign that's big enough to get out in front of the issue and explain things to people before they have to look at the price tag is absolutely critical. And there are chicken and egg problems that develop like this because until you know that the bond is feasible, it's hard to raise money. Don't know if it's feasible unless you have the money. And these things can create challenges. But I do think, again, as has been mentioned, there's reason for optimism this year. I strongly agree with Rick that the ballot is not that crowded. Obviously, the economy could get better, but it's better than it has been. So, it'd be nice to see these stars align, but there continue to be some challenges. There's also, we shouldn't let a discussion of water bond politics play out without some discussion of regional politics here. And people talk about north-south divides and things about water. I don't think that has to be the case in a water bond campaign. Somebody who is spending money against a measure could try to portray it that way, but I think that the north-south coalitions can be held together. We also have the overlay of BDCP, and if the water bond and that get confused, it could create some issues, so that's another thing that people will have to navigate. But I'll just wrap that up so we have some time for questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Looks like you all have a good future in marketing for Hurley if you can help us with some studies there, grow the brand. So thank you very much. Just a couple of questions. Actually, I'll have one or two, but I want to turn it over to anyone in the audience that may have a question for our panelists here. Don't everybody go at once. It's fine. It's okay. Oh, we have one over here. Okay, great.
My understanding is we have until about mid-June to get a new ballot measure on the ballot. We haven't heard really much from the governor. Do we have any idea what we may hear from him and when we may hear it?
First, about June, those deadlines are pretty flexible. The Secretary of State sets a deadline for final submission of language that can be printed for the November ballot, but those are soft deadlines. So we could move beyond that. I don't really want to, but we could. And if I heard the question is, we haven't heard much from the governor, and when do we expect to? Well, I don't know. I mean, sooner is better than later. I'll give you my nightmare scenario. My nightmare scenario is that we wait around for the governor, and I know why he's taking his time, and I respect it. I understand what's going on in his world. But we wait around and we wait around and we wait around, and we find ourselves in August, and we still have the current bond sitting there on the November ballot. We don't have a campaign infrastructure and fundraising underway because everybody still thinks we're going to replace it. And the governor finally says, I don't want anything to do with it. And then we're stuck with a very serious dilemma in August. We have an $11.1 billion bond that has been tainted, that has I think you call it a shadow, Leo, behind it. And we have to put together basically an emergency political campaign to try and raise enough money to be able to push it over the finish line. Without the governor's support, it would take probably not that much funded opposition to defeat us. Or we end up, again, this is August, final month of the legislative session, when a lot of other people are trying to make deals. We end up spinning around real fast and trying to come up with a 2/3 vote to push it off to 2016. And those are both really bad scenarios. And so I just think for all of the communities that need this bond, it behooves the governor to act sooner rather than later and not put us in that position. I think he's aware of that. I think his team's aware of that. I could always put Sandy Schubert on the spot since she's a member of the administration, and she could answer that question for all of us. But I think, let me answer it one more way. I know that the governor and his team are looking closely at this. In March, speaking to our board of directors, of course, he got a ton of questions about the water bond. And I expected him to say, well, we have a wall of debt. We've got to work down that debt. I don't want any more debt on the ballot. He didn't say that. He said, well, the polling numbers show that it's starting to look a little bit better to the voters, and so we're going to keep an eye on it. So I was very encouraged by that, but the clock is definitely ticking.
Any other questions out there?
Yes, actually.
Great. Where are you?
To your right. Ben.
Oh, there you are.
First of all, I'll take issue with the statement that was made that storage is for farmers. Storage is for everybody downstream of that storage, and even to some extent upstream. Storage is not just for farmers. Second of all, this 11.1 whatever it is billion that you're speaking about, I see no presentation that describes allocations for that 11.1 or 3, whatever it is. I've heard that there's 3 billion in there for storage, one way or another. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So I don't think 3 billion is going to get you too far, quite honestly, in today's world. And one thing that people do understand is that we're out of water. We're way out of water. And if this continues, we're going to be really way out of water. And what we need is storage. We've got to be able to bank this water when it's available through rainfall, snowpack. We're down to 14% on snowpack. That's insane. That's nothing. And if you've been up in the Sierras, you know it's nothing. There's nothing up there. So I think storage bond money would be the best way to get a bang for your buck. Because if you got it up here where you can use it later, that means a whole lot to what happens downstream from there. Just my opinion. Thank you.
Oh, one more question.
Thank you. There is, of course, a high-speed rail project out there. The governor's office has spoken up very much in support of that. The revised plan is out there, as you know. How does that interplay with this, and how do you get the governor to favor water over that if they're going to coincide?
That's a great question. Anyone want?
I'm not taking that one.
I won't answer that one.
I don't think I'm probably going to answer it, but I think, look, the governor obviously has made a commitment to the high-speed rail. He's taken a number of beatings, for that position from a number of different sides. My guess is that it can't be an either-or situation. It has to be, a combination situation. So I think maybe that's one of the leverage points with the governor. Is that, okay, fine, we understand that you're committed. You've made your stand on high-speed rail. However, we need a parallel stand, in terms of this water bond, because frankly, it's not going to be a big benefit to people to ride a high-speed rail if there in fact is no water when they turn on the faucet, when they get up in the morning to take their pills and take their shower or flush their toilet. So I think it's not going to be an either-or situation. It's going to have to be an and situation. But I do think there's some opportunities probably to use that parallel with the governor in terms of bringing this on board a little bit sooner. And Dave's right. I mean, this time is very, very short on this, and it's very easy to talk about raising $20 or $30 million, but we've all been in situations where, as they used to say, I grew up in Idaho. Talk is cheap. It takes money to buy whiskey. And, people sit around the table and say, gosh, $20 million, 5 here, 5 here, 5 here, 5 here, we've got it done. And, you find yourself 6 weeks later, and you still have a bank account with zero in it. So it's going to be very, very critical to move this as fast as you can and begin that fundraising effort. Otherwise, it's just going to be very, very difficult to win in November with that kind of a compressed time frame.
Okay, so I think there are no more questions. So I'll ask the last question, and we'll make it a lightning round question. So go around. So 1, can it pass? And 2, how much money is it going to take to do it?
Yes. Start with you. 20.
20?
Yes, more than 20. Don't know how much more. Depends on the funded opposition.
I think the answer is yes because of the political environment this year. But I think, again, it's depending on what's in the bond and how it's packaged. If you can make the case that it's affordable, adequate supply of clean water, and really get people focused on that concept, then I think you can do it for 20, 25 million.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, panel. Really great conversation. Appreciate the questions from everyone. Thank you very much. So I think we're going to wrap things up here pretty soon. So water is critical to California. It's time to invest in our future. We all need to share what we learn with our neighbors, our friends, and constituents. We need to do a better job communicating the importance and value of water. We can't do it alone. We all need to carry the message, do our part, use every single drop as wisely as we can build our future with a sustainable supply of water. Just like we said before, if 1 in 6 do not have access, 5 in 6 can help. So we can all work together to make our state even better as well. So with that, I'd like to close and thank a few people and organizations. So thank you again to the Disneyland Resort, our presenting sponsor and wonderful hosts. Big fan of the family. Thank you very much. Mesa Water District, our luncheon sponsor. Irvine Ranch Water District, our program sponsor. Our associate and table sponsors. David Onco, Chief Counsel, Head of Legal of the Disneyland Resort. Yep. And Frank Delanora, Director of Resort Environmental Affairs and Conservation. Great guy, if you haven't met him. The Municipal Water District of Orange County Board of Directors and staff. Great people. Jessica Auerkirk, Tiffany Baca, Mary Snow, and Darcy Burke. The Orange County Water District Board of Directors and staff. Eleanor Torres, Gina Pineda, Rose Wilk. And I'd like to thank my bosses at Hurley for letting me ditch and come out here and hanging out with you all. Really, really appreciate that. And thank you all for coming. One last thing, so housekeeping. Parking validation is available at the registration if you forgot to do that when you arrived. If you are requesting contact hours, please sign out on the way to the parking shuttle. Please mark your calendar for next year's summit, May 15, 2015. You're writing it down, I can see. So this ends our program, and I have to stop and say thank you all again, and I'm going to Disneyland. All right, bye guys, thank you.